wouldn't do any I'm sorry. It wouldn't do any harm for us to reference critical thinking with all the detail there is in our textbooks and classes and homework assignments. So it's not that we don't think there's potential for critical thinking to require or result in these descriptions. Um, we just think there are practical benefits from specifying what we do in critical thinking class. I use this textbook after using many others, and I'll reference their criteria for claims, which is just for them to be strong, they can get stronger. They have to be adequate, relevant, and acceptable. And then one thing we want to contrast to some other approaches that will reference critical thinking, but we think like vaguely and maybe a bit unseriously, is that there are particular assumptions that underlie standard critical thinking practice, in a classroom, in a course taught by a philosopher. And so we want to maybe point out that these are obvious and other approaches don't have such obvious commitments to an account of moral psychology, which, this might be a false account of moral psychology, but we want at least alternative approaches to meet this level of specificity. And then in our abstract for this work, we had thought about the benefits of a critical thinking approach in contrast to a debate approach. So I can return to these slides if we get into these issues, but we actually are going to try to look at maybe too much, but the main approaches used to attempt to reduce polarization. So now I'll go to the paper, but we can go back to the slides if we have time, and I will be very careful about how long this takes because I have timed myself. So we want to consider how critical thinking methodology might address the polarization crisis, but we don't want to assume critical thinking methodology is already involved in current approaches to the polarization crisis. I mean, we don't even want to assume the polarization crisis is a crisis, but we can look at the three main approaches being taken to it and contrast them to critical thinking and look for your corrections and insight. Again, literally what we want to reference is what we do in the classroom with charitable argument reconstruction, as it's actually done. In the paper ended up being a little longer than the talk, but I give an actual example of a charitably reconstructed argument that a student did and volunteered. The most common approaches to polarization are the bridging approach, which I wish I could ask if you're familiar with it, but I won't go on too long about it. I've been trained in it for a few years. It's the bridging of differences. So you're supposed to listen, respect, learn, take a new point of view. And then a second approach I want to contrast to critical thinking as taught in the classroom is the free speech approach, or ideological diversity, or heterodox academy, I quote. And then the third, which I breeze past, but I am a virtue ethicist, so it's strange I breeze past it, is the effort to describe the intellectual virtues. So emphasizing the virtues that would contribute to reduce polarization. There's, of course, merit in each of these approaches, and they also are being so actively developed, but we think, I want to be as tentative as possible, but as far as we can tell, they leave out the process of critical thinking that I test on in class, that I teach and test on in class. So we are suggesting that what we teach and test on in class involves practice with the epistemic status of claims, is readily accessible to most of us. I teach critical thinking to at-risk teenagers with low literacy. It encourages a confidence with reasoning apart from its impact on others. And that would mean, despite power dynamics between people and institutions, critical reasoning in the form of generating arguments for others. So we'll look at Steele Manning as overlapping with being charitable. we're going to suggest that this process brings its own satisfaction, and it's something like a felt calmness due to something like increased understanding of the strength of an argument. Our thesis is that the methodology used in critical thinking classes introduces what the more commonly recommended approaches to polarization should, but fail to, and that is the specification of a productive process that encourages direct engagement with argument and the strength of claims rather than with persons or groups. So bridging differences is really the dominant approach, is what the authors say, if not the primary process that's been called upon to address polarization. It attempts to aim us, I mean, this is their wording, to move us to the concept of belonging. The techniques they use are really familiar to me now because I've had experience with it for a few years. Always requires a facilitator, and it really focuses on gathering people who hold different views, values, and identities to hold structured conversations. The conversations are very structured, planned in advance, in order to find common ground. So you share personal stories or ask participants to demonstrate that they've listened to someone else's personal story, and they even look for acknowledgement of how painful sharing experiences might be. And they've used this approach a lot, or we, if you guys are facilitators of these groups, maybe. And so before the election, they ran a few groups, and the UK ran a few groups before Brexit. And these things are carefully studied. The questions are things like, I mean, and prepared carefully. And the question for a recent bridging event was, what are your hopes and fears going forward from this election? And participants get to answer while being promised no direct response. So I use that in the classroom sometimes. And sometimes participants get to decide what the goals are for the conversation. And then I think the rules are standardly that you only speak for yourself, which it does have an impact. And of course, you have to be respectful. And then they'll also ask you to listen without judgment. After these events, participants get asked if they're experiencing a stronger sense of empathy. And in the last one we looked to, the results were so positive, 70% of participants said yes to that question. But we're hoping it's obvious that these bridging events happening before elections don't seem to change things um, in terms of the election. And we would suggest that you'd expect some type of impact, but the researchers are beginning to worry, not just about the need to scale this, but about it not bringing about expected results, and also potential harm to marginalized participants. So they're really all over this, and being very, they're very focused researchers. And so they're getting data on how incredibly complex the power dynamics are, even in these bridging groups, and how complex our relationships are with others. I'll leave out the specifics. I think we referenced them in the longer version of this talk. But now the developers of bridging protocols issue cautions about how complex the mitigation of polarization is. So they were hoping they could mitigate it, but now they're suggesting, I mean, the most dramatic way I can put it is that we need more nuanced framing than the example I gave, because you could actually do harm to marginalized participants. And in order for bridging to be effective, they've figured you need relative equality and relatively equal agency in the group. So, discoveries. The newly considered possibility that polarization might be the result of inequity, the newly considered possibility, fits with these new concerns. The idea that contact between groups can actually promote polarization, and this would be like despite positive reviews of the experience in the short term. And so the researchers' worry is that some relevant factors have been left out, and some of these don't fit perfectly with our thesis, but things like the need for sustained contact. But then what does fit with our thesis is the genuine exchange of ideas. But then between individuals of similar social rank, we can use that as a negative support. And if you want to add to that complexity, groups recompose themselves over time. So in a sense, we're all moving targets for this adverse outcome they found from a bridging experience. I want to point out that the questions involved become philosophical. So I want a philosophical approach. Is polarization reduction a way to merely encourage silence from those who are exploited or oppressed? What if agents themselves are comfortable with polarization as a trade-off and researchers aren't even looking for that? What's the cost of generating apparent political stability? And then those questions, depend on what counts as a healthy democracy, whether power structures have to be addressed first, what type of efforts are even acceptable or within limits, what is this political ideal we're aiming for? Are we imagining relationships without bias and tension? Are we using an unrealistic account of human nature? I could go on and on. But we do think those questions are relevant. So we're looking for some way for people to be encouraged to take up those, annoying philosophical questions, which we're going to suggest are perfectly relevant to the success of bridging and to affective and belief polarization as it's been measured. Okay, the second approach is, I'm just calling it the free speech approach. I think I slip into calling it the ideological diversity approach. But this is a concern about self-censorship. And the idea is that self-censorship contributes to polarization and also bad political outcomes. Our complaint is that this assumes a lot of moral psychology and the benefit of processes that aren't specified. And we have even found supporters of this view, they'll just cite Mill's view on the political impact of self-censorship as if it's authoritative, so we would like these questions to continue to be taken up by people, whether empirically by research or in a philosophical way. And one representative of this view is Heterodox Academy, and they've been studying the level of the reluctance of students to engage in controversial topics on campus. And a 2023 result was that nearly half of surveyed students were reluctant to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, politics generally, and I think about 40% were reluctant to discuss transgender issues or identity. That was the category. And a third were reluctant to discuss abortion or religion in class. One thing that wasn't in one of the reports we looked at is that reluctance to engage in these topics over time has not grown across the board, and Black students have been reporting they're more comfortable speaking out on other topics that were considered controversial, but that wasn't highlighted in the public-facing report. The theory of Heterodox Academy is that universities or elite universities require adherence to closed-minded orthodoxies that stifle rigorous truth-seeking investigation of complex questions and issues. So I was quoting there. The solution they recommend is greater viewpoint diversity and protection for those who engage in diverse or heterodox thought. Their concerns are compatible with and seem to require traditional methods of debate. I mean, sometimes they say that, but not always. And the issue can't be which views are acceptable in advance. So a lively clash is what they have described as wanting, a lively clash between opinions and ideas. Because they like a clash, they point out that heterodox views will be upsetting, and sometimes they'll even say to the general population. But it's going to be a good target for those engaged in open debate. And these are where, like, the details and the process involved is vague to me. But I'm sure you're familiar with their general stance. We should not determine that any view is offensive in advance. And one concern we have about this type of approach is, as I mentioned, it relies on some practices that are not laid out for us to study, like the bridging approach has been studied, and look at the results and defend. And we're also a little bit worried about debate as an approach. They will describe this: you should argue as if you're right and then listen as if you're wrong. You should maintain interpretations of others' perspectives that are respectful and give the benefit of the doubt. That language is used, and they have many examples of professors being assumed to be racist or sexist because they're insensitive. That's like a repeat example in the book Coddling of the American Mind. And then they want you afterwards to be friendly and acknowledge you've learned something from each other. Just advice we see elsewhere, right? But we do think these descriptions are too ambiguous and vague. And just as one example of how we think more explanation is needed, they think it's good to be uncomfortable, but not good to argue you should feel safe. So being uncomfortable is good, but feeling unsafe would be a result of you having been coddled in the past and kind of picked up these ideological views that they think universities promote, kind of spread. And we just want more of an explanation there. Like these are like contestable accounts of us, and we would just like an explanation at the level of moral psychology that like the field of philosophy is working with. Social science, though, is always going to take an indirect approach to assessing the truth claims of any of our views. And this is great because you can measure effects and beliefs, and they're tracking motivated reasoning now. I'm very impressed. In party congruent misinformation, I'm impressed. But there is something about the free speech approach that we want to borrow or that we admire. And it is at least that they want to look at people's held beliefs. We're not concerned about unquestioned and dominant orthodoxies, but we also want to focus on what people actually believe. And they will actually specify, they'll put a belief in a sentence when it comes to what they think causes coddling certain beliefs. And we like that. That's what we do in critical thinking class. And then another complaint of ours is that they know more about the results of debate than they say. There's a large literature on this as well. And so some of the tactics that are effective in debate and some of the results of debate, they don't advertise. And we're a little worried that's deliberate. And having a debater as a co-author, we think agents themselves can recognize what it feels like and what is missing when you've lost a debate. So just a few descriptions. The experience of debate, we think, clearly relies on some thoughts that are done in advance and arguments that are plotted out in advance, and maybe one's skill in front of an audience. There could maybe be long-term provocations that come from this. You might think later, but we think this would be difficult to track, just like the bridging researchers have found longer-term impacts difficult to predict. And then, as so many have pointed out in the argumentation literature, a debater might have little reason to be charitable or steelman the other side. I mean, of course, it could be. It is a form of debate tactic, but do you have reasons to use that tactic? And then the engagement in real time, we think, is another limitation because it's going to reduce how reflective we can be about the points made, and the faux confidence that benefits a debater, we figure seems somewhat real to debaters from people having experience of this. And we're not looking to encourage that in a critical thinking class. So what we want to suggest instead is the same thing we do in critical thinking class. Steel manning and being charitable overlap there because we'll have our students reconstruct an argument by themselves over time on paper with help from the rest of us, looking at it claim by claim, in a manageable set of claims. We can transform the argument to make it strong and sometimes we will actually reject claims, revise the argument because we do not worry about accurately representing the source of the argument. So I'm fascinated by all these puzzles of applying the principle of charity, but we actually don't have a lot of those issues when we just assign argument reconstruction as homework. And then the benefits we think that could come from using critical thinking as an approach is that the attention isn't on the show or who won or who dominated, but on the argument itself. Slowness of thought can be incorporated. A second benefit is that we think it's going to build a sense of efficacy as you consider yourself, what information is relevant to an argument, where you might find it, and how to revise the claims in accordance with it. I emphasize the role of science in our reasoning in my critical thinking classes. So that's going to be something done very differently in a time-based debate. And then finally, we think there's a kind of earnestness in the idea of being charitable in our critical thinking tradition that supports the idea that we're reasoning with each other together, and that a bridging approach which avoids conflict by avoiding debate might be after the same thing we can bring about in a critical thinking class with our typical assignments. Okay, I'm not going to talk about the third approach to polarization, which would just be nice descriptions of virtues that are relevant. And all I'm going to say, and I hope this is provocative, I hope I'm wrong, is just that description is not a guide to behavior. So if there is work on the intellectual virtues that describes typical critical thinking lessons in class, let me know, but we haven't found it yet. All right, let me wrap up here with just a restatement of our thesis and a restatement of what we think we have. So our thesis is that despite the impact on others or on society, there are features that benefit us about standard critical thinking practice as done in a classroom. And we think some of this is how we're motivated to look to research and not concerned about how it will be taken. And we think the simple reconstruction of arguments helps us recognize things that the original author wouldn't deny and that we ourselves can use, a kind of a way to remind ourselves of the pitfalls we can fall into when we believe an argument is strong and we're finding others don't agree. And we think the position of being a steelmanner makes us philosophical, and even in light of empirical evidence. And at one point, the free speech approach really emphasized, I think University of Austin did this for a bit too, but they no longer do, but they really emphasized that claims had to be supported by empirical evidence. So we don't do that at all. So every empirical support is handled by the person reconstructing the argument, and we think that's a good lesson for how philosophical these issues are. I often use some of the, oh, Caroline, do you remember his name? I often use one of the top researchers on statistics in my class because he's so critical of empirical research, finish and published research. So we have to keep critically thinking even when the data is in. Andrew Gelman. Okay, in comparison to the bridging approach, we think the critical thinking approach has these advantages. They attempt to generate empathy for some person that doesn't share the same values, but we think this objective can be met with critical thinking methodology and doesn't involve the complications of power dynamics and relationships between persons that are time-based or maybe not long-lasting enough. And we also can acknowledge that there can be something false about the beliefs of participants in empathy building exercises. So we're going to address that head on, like we were saying, the free speech approach also allows. In comparison to the free speech approach, but then I'll also say the virtue approach, we think that there are it's right for people to point out that there can be incentives to befuddling an audience, and that's just not going to be the case when you're doing the work for yourself, looking at adequacy, relevance, and acceptable criteria for claims. We won't be looking to fabricate evidence or to flame prejudice or bias. Uh, Cynicism won't be a tempting tactic. And we're hoping it taps into the pleasure we have in truly understanding, even if it's understanding the limits of an argument. Others have described critical thinking in a kind of what we would think overblown way, that it requires valuing other points of view, staying well informed, and aiming to avoid intimidating or confusing others with your critical thinking prowess. I mean, that's all great, but we think that's more than is required. But we do think what is involved encourages some moral constraint, as others have pointed out with maybe the more bombastic descriptions of critical thinking. And in comparison to the focus on describing our virtues as critical thinkers or as just intellectually virtuous participants in a society, we think offering a method that we get better at and better at is just more helpful. And we also don't have to wait on identifying the virtuous or the good critical thinkers. We're not sure there's much of a consequence for us to be less good at critical thinking than we think we are, or for some bar to be met. We think this process it feels good to people and does not backfire or reinforce bad feelings or cover over sources of legitimate disagreement in the way you risk when you have groups of people bridging. So the fact that critical thinking's methodology can impact the agent herself might be playing it safe, but we want to point out that the free speech approach that does worry we spread or catch ideas from some place, like microaggressions is one example. I guess they do blame the person who first developed that concept. It does depend upon something like we're referencing. So if there's any defense at all against social contagions like that, it has to be the reasoning of each of us agents. So, even the books on that approach are an appeal to these agents and their ability to follow arguments. The books are not a lively clash of ideas or a debate. So we're simply recommending that we want to encourage our attending what it takes for an agent to assess the strength of an argument. And we think there's no better description, positive or negative, of this process than that is in our critical thinking textbooks that we practice and teach on a weekly basis. Thank you, guys. Oh.